The envelope was damp with Moscow rain when Oleg Penkovsky pressed it into foreign hands. And in that small transfer of paper, there was already a death sentence waiting somewhere in the dark. He had not yet been arrested, not yet accused, not yet broken beneath the lamps of an interrogation room, but the machine that ruled his life had begun, almost imperceptibly, to turn toward him. Welcome back, listeners. Today, we delve into the shadows to uncover the story of Oleg Penkovsky, the Soviet colonel who stepped out from behind the Iron Curtain and into one of the most dangerous intelligence games of the Cold War. A man who fed secrets to the West while the world drifted toward nuclear fire, and who learned, as all spies eventually do, that once history notices your footsteps, it is usually too late to turn back. To understand Penkovsky, you have to begin not with the man alone, but with the suffocating age that produced him. The Cold War was not merely a rivalry between flags. It was a climate of suspicion that entered private kitchens, military academies, embassy corridors, rail stations, and children's classrooms. It was a war of silence, of posture, of hidden microphones in walls and names erased from public memory. By the late 1950s, Moscow had become a city of ceremonies on the surface and fear beneath. Red banners fluttered over avenues broad enough for tanks. Brass bands played. Official newspapers promised strength, destiny, and final victory. Yet behind closed apartment doors, people lowered their voices before speaking of the state, and in the long winter evenings, the Soviet Union asked from its citizens not merely obedience, but faith. Nikita Khrushchev stood at the center of that age, pounding shoes on podiums, promising missiles like sausages, boasting that history had chosen his system. The West looked eastward through a haze of uncertainty. How many missiles did the Soviets really possess? How strong were their rocket forces? How far had their military science advanced? Men in Langley, in Washington, in London, in Whitehall, and inside the old quiet rooms where MI6 and the CIA measured probabilities and nightmares, were haunted by the same question. Was Moscow bluffing? Or was it already prepared for a war that could erase cities in a single afternoon? This was the background music of Penkovsky's life. It was not abstract. It shaped every uniform, every posting, every expression worn in public. He had been born on April 23, 1919, in Vladikavkaz, then often still known by its Soviet-era name, Ordzhonikidze, in the North Caucasus. That date matters because he was born into one Russia and came of age in another. The old world of family reputation, officers, and private loyalties had already been crushed and remade by revolution. His father had served on the white side in the Russian Civil War and died there, a fact that could never entirely disappear from the biography of a son trying to rise inside the Soviet state. Imagine the burden of that. In a country where bloodlines were politically legible, where history could be inherited like an accusation, Penkovsky learned early that survival required self-discipline, ambition, and an instinct for concealing the innermost self. He entered the Red Army in 1937, still young, still shaping himself, and like millions of others, he was swept into the furnace of the era. Then came the German invasion, the vast convulsion of the Second World War, what the Soviet Union would forever call the Great Patriotic War. Penkovsky served as an artillery officer. He was wounded in 1944. That wound stayed with him, physically and psychologically. War often does that. It places a man in the direct company of death, strips slogans down to their bones, and teaches him the difference between official rhetoric and what actually happens when shells fall. I have often thought that one of the hidden roots of espionage lies there, in the space between doctrine and reality. A man hears one truth from the state and sees another in the mud. Once that fracture opens, it rarely closes cleanly. After the war, Penkovsky did what ambitious Soviet officers were expected to do. He studied. He advanced. He entered the Frunze Military Academy between 1945 and 1948, then moved into the military intelligence apparatus, the GRU, after further training at the Military Diplomatic Academy from 1949 to 1953. Those institutions were not merely schools, they were filters. They selected men who could memorize, endure, flatter, conform, and perform. They rewarded discipline, technical competence, and ideological reliability, at least on the surface. By the 1950s, Penkovsky was inside the Soviet military intelligence world, a place where rank and favor mattered, where proximity to important marshals could shape a career, and where one's life could rise or collapse on a whisper. He was not a drifter. He was not some romantic adventurer who stumbled into espionage out of boredom. He was a serious insider. He knew artillery. He knew military structures. He understood the language of reports, inventories, deployments, doctrine. He moved among officials who discussed missiles and war plans, scientific research, and strategic capabilities. By 1960, he had become a colonel in the GRU and deputy chief of the foreign section of the State Committee for the Coordination of Scientific Research. The title sounds bureaucratic, but in the Soviet system, bureaucracy was often another face of power. That committee touched the nerve center where science, military procurement, foreign collection, and strategic ambition met. Penkovsky was close enough to hear things that men in Washington and London desperately wanted to know. And yet, what drives a man like that to betray the state that made him? The answer is never as simple as greed. In Penkovsky's case, disillusionment seems to have run deep. He had seen the system from within. He had watched promotions, petty tyrannies, political maneuvering, and what he believed to be reckless leadership at the top. Khrushchev's swagger, his public exaggerations about Soviet strength, his dangerous appetite for confrontation, all of this appears to have mattered. Penkovsky was not only passing secrets. In his own mind, and perhaps this is where the tragedy begins, he may have believed he was intervening in history, not for money alone, not even for the West as such, but to prevent catastrophe, to expose bluff before bluff became apocalypse. There is something unbearably lonely about that kind of conviction. A spy who sells information for comfort can compartmentalize. A spy who believes he is acting for a higher reason must carry a far heavier burden because he begins to see himself as morally responsible for outcomes he cannot control. He walks the streets with too much knowledge. He hears people laugh at receptions, clink glasses, discuss weather and trade and theater, while in his mind entire capitals burn in mushroom light. In July 1960, Penkovsky made one of his first dangerous moves. In Moscow, near the Bolshoi-Moskvoretsky Bridge, he approached American students and gave them a package intended for the U.S. Embassy. Think about the sheer audacity of that. A serving Soviet military intelligence officer, under the eye of one of the most paranoid security states in history, trying to push his way into contact with the Americans through such a risky opening. It was not elegant tradecraft. It was desperation mixed with determination. Perhaps he sensed that careful channels were not available to him. Perhaps he feared delay. Perhaps he simply understood that in the Soviet Union, a man could wait too long and lose the courage forever. The CIA did not immediately embrace him. And in fairness, one can understand why. Moscow was full of traps. Every dangle, every seeming volunteer might be a provocation run by the KGB. American officers stationed there knew that a single clumsy approach could trigger an international incident, compromise an embassy, ruin ongoing operations. In intelligence work, the most valuable walk-in can resemble the most dangerous deception. This is one of the cruel ironies of espionage. Real help often first appears indistinguishable from bait. So Penkovsky remained in motion, restless, taking risks, waiting for the West to decide whether to trust him. Somewhere in that waiting period, his psychological burden must have deepened. He had already crossed an inner threshold. Once a man has decided to betray, even before he succeeds, he is no longer what he was. He begins living in two time zones. One is the visible daily routine. The other is the secret future in which exposure, arrest, or escape already exists. Then opportunity arrived through Britain. MI6 found a way to use a man who looked about as far from a cinematic spy as one could imagine. Greville Wynne was a British businessman who traveled behind the Iron Curtain for commercial reasons. He sold industrial goods. He attended trade functions. He wore the respectable face of ordinary commerce. He was not a hard-eyed assassin. He was precisely the sort of person the Invisible War loved most, because he could move through official spaces without setting off alarms. In November 1960, British intelligence began drawing him into the Penkovsky operation. This was the beauty and the cruelty of Cold War tradecraft. The best cover often looked dull, not dramatic, not glamorous, not thrilling. A briefcase, a ticket, a hotel receipt, a business luncheon, a man complaining about schedules and customs forms. That was how empires stole each other's secrets. Not always with guns in alleyways, but with conferences, cocktail chatter, and the dead calm of paperwork. In April 1961, Penkovsky traveled to London under official Soviet cover. The year matters. April 1961 was not a quiet month in world history. That same season, the Bay of Pigs invasion exploded in failure, exposing the limits of American covert power and sharpening Cold War anxiety. Berlin remained a wound. Within months, the Berlin Wall would begin to rise in August 1961, pouring concrete into the center of Europe's divided conscience. The world was hardening, and in London, amid all that pressure, Penkovsky met with a joint team from MI6 and the CIA. Picture the atmosphere. London in spring, damp pavements, soft gray light, cars hissing across wet streets, a city carrying its imperial habits with tired elegance. Somewhere behind ordinary doors, officers from Allied services sat across from a Soviet colonel and tried to determine whether he was genuine, stable, controllable, useful. For Penkovsky, those meetings were the crossing of a final line. No more gestures, no more overtures. From that point forward, he was an active source for the West. The CIA gave him the cryptonym Hero. MI6 reportedly used Yoga. Those names sound almost absurdly detached from the flesh and blood terror of the work, but cryptonyms are like that. They flatten a soul into a filing term. Somewhere in an archive, a life becomes a label. Yet behind the label sat a man with a wife, Vera, and children. A man whose father's memory and wartime scars and career frustrations all converged in that one decision to hand the hidden map of Soviet strength to foreign powers. From April 1961 to August 1962, Penkovsky delivered an extraordinary volume of material. More than 5,000 photographs of classified Soviet documents would eventually be attributed to his espionage. Reports, manuals, technical data, missile information, organizational charts, assessments that allowed the Americans and British to see through layers of bluff. He did not just pass gossip, he passed structure. He helped Western intelligence understand what Soviet missile sites looked like, how systems were organized, where strengths ended and weaknesses began. This is what made him so valuable. A single dramatic secret can make headlines, but the deepest intelligence often lies in pattern, in interpretation, in the patient assembly of a puzzle whose shape only becomes clear after months of work. You and I, listeners, can easily underestimate what that means. Imagine analysts in Washington opening material from Moscow and realizing that the feared missile gap was not what it seemed. Imagine the mood in Langley as Penkovsky's reporting began confirming that Khrushchev had exaggerated Soviet long-range missile strength. Imagine the relief mixed with dread. Relief, because the adversary was weaker than feared. Dread, because weaker powers can become more dangerous when bluffing fails. A man cornered by his own propaganda may take reckless action to restore credibility. Penkovsky's own method of living through this operation required almost unbearable composure. In Moscow, he still wore the Soviet officer's face. He still attended functions, carried on routines, moved through offices, used rank and professional purpose as camouflage. This is what deep cover looks like when turned inward. He was not building a new identity in a foreign country. He was building a hollow chamber inside his existing one. Every familiar room became hostile terrain. Every colleague might be watching. Every driver, porter, secretary, telephone operator, and plainclothes tail might be a witness in waiting. The British developed local handling arrangements in Moscow that depended on a small cast of outwardly unremarkable figures. Among the most important was Janet Chisholm, the wife of MI6 officer Roderick Chisholm, who was serving under diplomatic cover at the British Embassy. She appeared to be what Soviet observers expected to see: a diplomat's wife, a mother, a foreign woman navigating the restricted routines of embassy life in Moscow. That very ordinariness became a weapon. Penkovsky could meet her in public locations, pass material concealed in everyday objects, exploit that tiny margin in which normal social behavior overlaps with espionage. There is an almost heartbreaking intimacy to some of those methods. A packet tucked into something like a box of sweets. Signals arranged through simple visual markers. Encounters in parks or on city streets under the gaze of statues, trolley wires, and the immense, unsmiling facades of Soviet buildings. No fireworks. Just nerves. Just seconds. Just the feeling that your heartbeat has suddenly become loud enough for strangers to hear. The meetings in Moscow during late 1961 and early 1962 took place against a tightening international crisis. August 1961 saw the Berlin Wall go up. That was more than a barrier. It was a declaration that Europe's division had become architectural, concrete, militarized, permanent in appearance if not in destiny. Penkovsky, sitting in Moscow, certainly understood what that meant. He was watching a system resort to stone and wire to hold its people in place. For a disillusioned insider, the moral symbolism could hardly have been lost. Then there was tradecraft itself, that cold art of improvising normality while every instinct screams to flee. The public imagines spies as creatures of action, but in truth, many operations are built on restraint. Do not look back too sharply. Do not alter your pace. Do not acknowledge a contact too warmly. Do not return too soon to the same street. Do not show fear after a successful pass, because fear itself is visible. Penkovsky had to master all of this while carrying the additional danger that he was not an embassy officer protected by diplomatic immunity. If he was caught, there would be no formal shield, only prison, trial, and whatever final procedure the Soviet state reserved for traitors. And perhaps this is the moment to pause and ask what it feels like to become such a man. Not in theory, in the body. Imagine waking in your Moscow apartment before dawn in January 1962, the windows edged with frost, radiators knocking faintly, your wife still asleep, your children quiet in their beds. Outside, the city is a pale blue of early winter, smoke hanging above rooftops. You rise and dress for another official day. You knot your tie. You check your expression in the mirror. On the surface, nothing is wrong. But inside your briefcase, or your memory, or hidden elsewhere, is information that could reshape military calculations in Washington. The state you serve would kill you for it. Yet you proceed to breakfast. You pour tea. You answer ordinary questions. That is the true theater of espionage. Not courage in one blazing instant, but sustained duplicity in the company of people you love. Some accounts suggest Penkovsky grew increasingly intense, even reckless, as the operation continued. That would be understandable. Success can intoxicate a source. A man who has passed material once and survived often begins to believe he can survive indefinitely. He may also feel urgency. The more he learns, the more he feels history accelerating, the more tempted he becomes to push beyond prudent limits. Handlers must always manage that danger. They need information, but they also need their source alive. Every extra meeting, every extra document, every extra act of courage contains a hidden tax. In the spring and summer of 1962, Penkovsky continued to travel abroad under Soviet auspices, including visits to London and Paris. Those trips offered additional opportunities for direct contact with Western officers. Foreign travel for a Soviet military intelligence colonel was both a privilege and a risk. It gave him space to meet handlers, receive equipment, clarify requirements, and transfer material. But it also increased the chance that Soviet counterintelligence would review his movements more carefully later. Every hotel stay, every unexplained minute, every repeated acquaintance could become evidence in retrospect. And all the while, beneath the official conversations about steel, research, and trade delegations, the larger storm was gathering over Cuba. Operation Anadir, the Soviet deployment of missiles and forces to Cuba in 1962, was one of the boldest and most dangerous gambles of the Cold War. Khrushchev wanted to alter the strategic balance, defend Castro after the Bay of Pigs, and place the United States under direct nuclear pressure. But for such a gamble to succeed, secrecy and deception were essential. The Soviets needed the Americans to misunderstand what was being moved, how fast, and with what capability. This is precisely the sort of moment when one well-placed human source can matter more than squadrons of aircraft. Penkovsky's reporting helped Western analysts understand Soviet missile systems and recognize what U-2 imagery in Cuba was actually showing. He did not single-handedly solve the crisis. History is never that clean. But he helped make the Soviet deployment legible before it matured into an irreversible strategic fact. It is difficult to overstate the psychological pressure of that knowledge. Penkovsky was not merely betraying troop placements. He was watching the world edge toward a confrontation in which his information might influence whether presidents, premiers, generals, and admirals miscalculated. Somewhere in those months, he must have wondered whether he had already done enough, whether the West understood the danger, whether Moscow was moving faster than anyone knew. At the same time, another set of eyes was slowly adjusting focus onto him. The KGB and Soviet military counterintelligence were not fools. Too many romantic retellings of espionage turn one side into elegant masterminds and the other into lumbering policemen. The truth is darker. Both sides contained brilliance, caution, vanity, and error. A source as productive as Penkovsky generated patterns, and patterns eventually cast shadows. A foreign businessman appeared too useful. Embassy-linked figures behaved in ways that did not quite fit routine. A Soviet officer visited places and people under circumstances that might, in isolation, mean nothing, but in accumulation began to whisper of treason. One of the terrible features of surveillance states is that they can afford patience. They do not always need certainty at once. They can watch. They can photograph. They can wire apartments, offices, telephones, and meeting places. They can compare reports from street observers with technical intercepts and diplomatic logs. They can build a case slowly, waiting not only to catch the source, but to expose the network around him. By 1962, that possibility was hanging over Penkovsky like unseen weather. Still, the meetings continued. The operation had momentum. The machinery of intelligence collection is rarely easy to stop once high-value reporting begins to flow. Handlers become hungry. Headquarters asks for more. Analysts generate new questions. The source feels indispensable. Everyone tells themselves that one more exchange is worth the risk. There is a melancholy in this pattern because, listeners, you and I already know what the men and women inside the story did not. We know that operations often contain the seeds of their own destruction. The very success that proves a source's value also increases the adversary's incentive to find the leak. Penkovsky's triumph was also his beacon. Every accurate Western judgment about Soviet missiles, every strangely informed assessment, every concealed bruise on Soviet prestige made someone in Moscow ask where the blood was coming from. And then there was betrayal, as a category larger than any one person. Cold War intelligence services were riddled with penetrations, defections, suspicions, half-truths, and retrospective accusations. Even today, historians still debate exactly when and how the Soviets pieced together the Penkovsky case. Was he detected quickly and watched? Was there a mole? Did operational carelessness play the larger role? The uncertainty itself is instructive. In espionage, you are often destroyed not by a single obvious mistake, but by the convergence of small vulnerabilities you never see assembled in one room. By late summer and early autumn of 1962, the atmosphere around Penkovsky was changing. The Cuban Missile Crisis had not yet publicly exploded, but the diplomatic weather was electric. Flights were watched, embassies were watched, military conversations hardened. The city of Moscow, already tense by nature, seemed to hold its breath beneath the rituals of normal life. Imagine the broad roads around the Kremlin under a lowering sky. Imagine traffic moving as usual, trams grinding, women carrying shopping bags, soldiers at their posts, children hurrying home before the cold. And somewhere among them, a colonel of the GRU, carrying secrets for the enemy, perhaps already sensing that eyes lingered too long. On October 22, 1962, while President John F. Kennedy was preparing to address the world about Soviet missiles in Cuba, Penkovsky was arrested by Soviet authorities. The date lands like a hammer because it bound his personal fate to the most dangerous public confrontation of the Cold War. As Washington and Moscow moved to the brink of nuclear war, one of the West's greatest sources inside the Soviet system vanished into custody. But before that final net closed, there was a period of dread, half seen and half felt, when the operation was still technically alive and yet already beginning to rot from within. Those are the hours I find hardest to forget. The moments when a spy still speaks, still smiles, still passes material, while the darkness has already taken a seat at the table. Think of Penkovsky in those last meetings. Perhaps his instincts had sharpened. Perhaps he noticed a familiar face twice on the same route. Perhaps he found the city's silence altered, as though ordinary sounds had become staged. A car door shutting too neatly, footsteps holding distance, a man lingering with a newspaper, a telephone ring that carried no voice on the other end. Tradecraft teaches you to distrust coincidence, but it does not teach you what to do when all coincidences begin to feel like destiny. There were signals in the case, signs arranged to tell handlers whether a dead drop had been loaded or a contact remained viable. Such systems are elegant until they become terrifying, because once surveillance penetrates them, a signal may no longer mean what it once meant. It may still appear in the right place, at the right hour, in the right form, and yet now it belongs to the enemy. That is one of the most chilling ideas in espionage, that certainty can be forged, that the signs you rely upon for survival can be imitated by the very men preparing your ruin. And what of his family? We too easily leave them at the edges of the frame. Vera, his wife, the daughters. They lived inside the same apartment, under the same portrait-haunted Soviet sky, without fully controlling the terrible currents moving beneath the household. Every spy asks his family to bear a risk they did not choose. Even when they suspect, they rarely know the scale. The children still hear chairs scrape at dinner. They still see a father rub his temples, stare too long from a window, or come home carrying the fatigue of two incompatible loyalties. The family is often the last innocent cover an intelligence officer possesses, and the first thing history punishes. In the end, that is what makes Penkovsky's story so haunting. He was not operating in a frontier zone, or a jungle war, or a shattered, failed state. He was operating at the polished center of one of the two great nuclear powers on Earth. His battlefield was made of offices, embassies, theater tickets, diplomatic bags, camera film, briefing papers, coded habits, and the expressions worn by people who must never appear startled. He fought with memory, paper, nerve, and timing. He fought a secret war in which a misplaced glance could matter more than a bullet. And as 1962 moved toward its cold, fateful October, the pressure became almost cosmic. Cuba burned in the imagination of presidents. Berlin remained a loaded gun in Europe. The KGB listened. The CIA analyzed. MI6 maneuvered through thin margins and old networks. The GRU stood inside the Soviet military machine, proud and hard and intolerant of betrayal. Between them all moved one man from Vladikavkaz, a war veteran, a colonel, a husband, a father, a believer in something that had turned against belief itself. He had wanted, it seems, to warn the West that Soviet power was not what Khrushchev boasted. He had wanted to puncture the myth before myth dragged nations into annihilation. He had passed secrets through London and Moscow, through Greville Wynne and Janet Chisholm, through parks and receptions and innocuous objects carrying lethal significance. He had helped illuminate the hidden outline of Soviet missiles. He had become indispensable. And that, perhaps more than anything else, was the danger. No one remains indispensable in the spy world without eventually attracting the full weight of someone else's fear. The tragedy was no longer approaching from afar. It was there already, just beyond the door, listening. When they came for him, they did not come with theatrical rage. States like the Soviet Union rarely needed theatrics at the moment of capture. They preferred certainty, a quiet interception, a sealed car door, the short, devastating sentence that leaves no room for misunderstanding. On October 22, 1962, as the world strained to hear President Kennedy's words on Cuba and to guess whether dawn would bring invasion or nuclear fire, Oleg Penkovsky disappeared into the Soviet security system. The man who had helped the West understand the anatomy of Soviet missiles was now himself in the hands of the machine he had betrayed. There is a special horror in arrest during a national crisis, the personal and the global collapse into one another. Outside, history is still moving in giant, visible shapes. Broadcasts, embassies, military alerts, convoys, meetings at the Kremlin, meetings at the White House. Inside the prison cell, there is only the scrape of a chair, the smell of damp walls, and the knowledge that nobody is coming to explain the world to you anymore. Penkovsky had spent months helping the West read Soviet intentions. Now he could no longer read anything beyond the next locked door. Lubyanka. Even the name carries a kind of iron chill. The great building in Moscow had long stood as one of the central emblems of Soviet fear. Through Stalin's purges, wartime arrests, post-war investigations, and the long gray seasons of ideological vigilance, men and women had entered its orbit and never returned whole. By 1962, its corridors no longer belonged to the age of midnight mass purges on the same scale as the 1930s, but terror does not need to remain spectacular to remain effective. It only needs memory. Every Soviet citizen knew, in one way or another, what those rooms represented. A silence enforced by procedure. Confessions extracted under light and fatigue. Careers dissolved. Families contaminated by association. In such places, architecture itself seems to interrogate you. I often think the first hours after arrest are the truest test of a spy's soul. Before the formal indictment, before the show trial, before the legend. In those first hours, the prisoner does not yet know what the enemy knows. He does not know whether his contacts have been arrested, whether his apartment has been searched, whether a hidden film cartridge has been found, whether a surveillance photograph has already fixed him in the act. He is suspended in an abyss of incomplete knowledge. Every answer he gives may save or destroy him. Every silence may be interpreted as proof. It is not just fear of death that bears down then. It is fear of the unknown dossier. Penkovsky was not the only one caught in the net. Greville Wynne, his courier and outside bridge to MI6 and the CIA, was arrested on November 2, 1962, in Budapest. That date mattered because the Cuban Missile Crisis was only just easing after the most dangerous days in late October. The superpowers had stepped back from the edge, but individual lives were still dropping into the void. Wynne, outwardly a businessman, was taken and ultimately brought into the Soviet orbit for prosecution. So the operation that had run through Moscow, London, and the uneasy middle spaces of Europe was no longer an active intelligence triumph. It had become a counterintelligence spectacle. One can imagine the Soviet calculation with brutal clarity. In the aftermath of the Cuba confrontation, with the Kremlin bruised and furious, Penkovsky's case offered an opportunity. Here was a traitor from within the military intelligence system itself. Here was proof, or rather usable proof, that hostile foreign services had penetrated Soviet ranks. Here was a public stage on which the regime could dramatize vigilance, punish disloyalty, and remind every officer, scientist, diplomat, and ambitious bureaucrat that the state could still reach into the heart of any life and tear out the secret. But before the public theater came the private assault. Interrogation is not merely a search for facts. It is a campaign to reorder the prisoner's inner world. Sleep becomes irregular. Light becomes hostile. Time breaks apart. Questions circle back. Statements are read aloud, altered, placed beside other statements. The interrogator offers certainty where the captive has only dread. He suggests that resistance is useless, that colleagues have confessed, that foreign handlers have abandoned him, that the moral meaning of loyalty has already been decided by others in higher rooms. The goal is not always immediate confession. Sometimes it is psychological relocation. The prisoner must be moved from being the owner of his own story to merely one witness among many, and ultimately, not the most important witness. What did Penkovsky think in those rooms? Did he cling to the belief that he had done something necessary, perhaps even noble? Did he replay each meeting in Moscow, each packet passed, each conversation abroad, searching for the moment he had been seen too clearly? Did he curse the West for not rescuing him? Did he curse himself for imagining rescue was ever possible? We cannot enter his mind without trespassing into speculation. Yet the shape of the pressure is not difficult to imagine. He had lived for 2 years under the discipline of concealment. Now concealment itself had become impossible. The walls were closing not only around his body, but around the narrative by which he had justified himself. The Cuban Missile Crisis intensified everything. Let us sit for a moment in that wider darkness. On October 16, 1962, Kennedy had been shown the U-2 photographs revealing Soviet missile sites in Cuba. On October 22, he addressed the nation. The world heard, perhaps with a numbness that only later turned into terror, that Soviet offensive missile bases had been discovered 90 miles from Florida. The following days became a choreography of brinkmanship, naval quarantine, military alerts, Kremlin messages, secret bargaining. In those same days, Penkovsky, whose reporting had helped Western analysts identify the significance of missile deployments and understand Soviet capabilities more clearly, was already inside prison. There is something almost unbearably tragic in that juxtaposition. At the very moment his information was proving its historic value, his life had already been consumed by the act of providing it. He would not be the man who returned in triumph to a safe house, embraced by grateful handlers, his courage formally recognized in calm memoirs. Real espionage seldom grants such clean endings. More often the source is seized just before the consequence of his work becomes fully visible. He becomes a ghost at the feast, essential and absent at once. By early 1963, the Soviet state had prepared its case. The trial opened in Moscow on May 7, 1963. Penkovsky stood not as a misunderstood dissenter or a man pleading moral necessity, but as the regime intended him to stand. a military intelligence colonel charged with treason. Wynne appeared beside him as the foreign accomplice, the visible Western channel through which the infection of betrayal had spread. Soviet trials of this kind were never only about law. They were instruction. A regime does not merely punish, it narrates punishment for the benefit of the living. Imagine the courtroom air. The heavy stillness before proceedings. Uniforms, officials, stenographers, the controlled arrangement of faces. No spontaneous life. No genuine suspense regarding the verdict. These events were choreographed with care, though even choreography cannot fully conceal the human tremor underneath. Penkovsky was not some anonymous functionary selected for disposal. He was a decorated veteran, a senior insider, a man who had moved near the upper reaches of the Soviet military and scientific establishment. His fall warned others with exceptional force, because it said that even the ambitious, even the decorated, even those who had climbed close to power could be recast overnight as filth. Accounts from the time describe guilty pleas. Whether such pleas were the product of genuine strategic calculation, psychological collapse, coercion, or some combination of all three, they belonged to the ritual logic of the Soviet judicial spectacle. A confession in that setting did more than save time. It ratified the state's version of reality. It turned a contested human life into an approved moral lesson. And yet I suspect that beneath the public language, the courtroom contained a quieter and more haunting truth. The Cold War had trained both sides to speak in abstractions: capitalism, socialism, peace, aggression, stability, security. But in the end, these abstractions always crashed into individuals. One man in a defendant's chair, one wife listening for news that may ruin the rest of her life, one child who will grow up carrying the surname of a condemned traitor, one courier aging years in prison within months, one intelligence analyst in Washington reading reports whose source is now beyond all help. Grand strategy and private grief are never really separate. History merely pretends they are. Penkovsky was sentenced to death. Wynne received 8 years of imprisonment. 4 days after the trial began, the shape of their futures had been fixed by the Soviet state. On May 16, 1963, according to the official Soviet announcement, Penkovsky was executed. That is the date history generally keeps. But even here, as so often in the secret world, certainty frays at the edges. Rumors circulated for years about the manner of his death. Some spoke of execution by shooting. Others hinted at darker and more theatrical methods, as if the Cold War could not resist inventing one more layer of cruelty for the man who had betrayed Moscow at such a moment. Legend gathered around the gap between statement and proof. It usually does when states kill behind closed doors. For the purpose of understanding his life, however, the method matters less than the silence after it. A human being who once moved through offices, family rooms, foreign receptions, and winter streets had been reduced to a date: May 16, 1963. The Soviet Union closed the file with bureaucratic confidence. But history does not close so cleanly. History leaves after-images. What had his betrayal achieved? That is the question every listener must eventually ask, and it is not comfortable, because it resists both easy glorification and easy condemnation. Penkovsky did not bring down the Soviet Union. He did not liberate Eastern Europe. He did not end the arms race. He did not even prevent all future dangers. The Cold War would drag on for decades after his death. Crises would come and go. Men in Moscow and Washington would continue staring across the nuclear divide. Yet to say he changed nothing would be false. The intelligence he provided between April 1961 and August 1962 gave Britain and the United States an unusually clear view into Soviet missile capabilities and military realities at a time when misperception could have been fatal. In a world haunted by the supposed missile gap, he helped puncture illusion. And illusion, listeners, can kill more efficiently than hatred. When governments misjudge an adversary's strength, they may overreact in panic or yield in fear. When leaders bluff too far, they may trap themselves in their own propaganda. Penkovsky's reporting did not solve the Cuban Missile Crisis alone, but it helped Western leaders and analysts interpret the evidence before them with greater confidence. That matters. In October 1962, confidence rooted in accurate intelligence may have been one of the thin, invisible threads preventing catastrophe. This is why some later called him a man who helped save the world. It is a dramatic phrase, perhaps too dramatic for the sober historian. The world is rarely saved by one person. It is usually preserved by layers of caution, luck, restraint, competent analysis, and mutual fear. Yet phrases like that endure because they try to honor something real. Penkovsky entered the machinery of espionage at a moment when the margin for error had nearly vanished. He paid with his life. The possibility that his work helped steady Western judgment during the most perilous nuclear crisis in history is not sentimental invention. It is part of the terrible arithmetic of the age. Still, praise is too simple. Espionage is never pure. Penkovsky was not only a tragic hero. He was also a betrayer of his oath, a man who turned against his own service and endangered colleagues, networks, and perhaps innocent bystanders who had no idea they stood near an invisible front. The Soviet state was brutal, yes. Khrushchev's leadership could be reckless, yes. But no intelligence operation unfolds without collateral damage. Documents passed from Moscow to London and Washington did not float there in moral isolation. They were embedded in institutions, in rivalries, in military planning, in the quiet exposure of careers and systems. To acknowledge his courage does not require pretending his choices were clean. That moral ambiguity is part of what gives his story its lasting power. Penkovsky does not fit neatly into the role of saint, villain, martyr, or opportunist. He was, as so many Cold War figures were, a man trapped between genuine conviction and compromising methods. He believed the Soviet leadership, particularly under Khrushchev, was reckless and dangerous. He seems to have believed the West needed the truth. He may also have felt personal resentment, frustration, and injured ambition inside a system that rewarded conformity and distrusted independent judgment. Human motives are rarely singular. They layer, they contradict, they harden under pressure. And what of the adversary he faced? The KGB, the GRU, the Soviet prosecutors, the gray cadre of officers who watched, questioned, recorded, and condemned him. It is tempting, especially in stories like these, to cast them as faceless darkness. But that too would be a simplification. Those men believed themselves defenders of the state. They lived in a civilization shaped by invasion, encirclement, revolution, sacrifice, and fear. They had seen the Soviet Union lose millions in the war against Nazi Germany. They had internalized the lesson that foreign penetration was not an abstract danger, but a mortal threat. Within that mental universe, Penkovsky was not a principled whistleblower. He was a contagion. Their ruthlessness came not only from cruelty, though there was plenty of that, but from an entire strategic culture in which disloyalty could never be a private matter. That is what makes the Cold War so difficult to narrate honestly. Everyone carried scars, everyone carried doctrines. Everyone believed they were standing against annihilation. And in that belief, everyone learned to excuse things that, in a gentler century, would have seemed monstrous. While Penkovsky faced death, Greville Wynne entered another form of slow destruction. He was imprisoned, interrogated, and held in harsh conditions that battered his health. Prison does strange things to those who survive it. Time becomes granular. The body shrinks to its grievances. The mind cycles through memory until memory itself becomes punishment. A businessman who had become, almost by accident, one of the West's most important couriers, now sat with the consequences in his bones. On April 22, 1964, he was finally released in an exchange for Soviet intelligence officer Gordon Lonsdale, whose real name was Konon Molody. Such exchanges have an odd, almost ceremonial quality. States that publicly denounce espionage with moral fury quietly acknowledge its logic by trading captured agents like expensive chess pieces. The swap does not erase suffering, it merely formalizes it. Wynne returned physically damaged and psychologically shaken. That, too, is part of the hidden cost of secret wars. The courier, the cutout, the embassy spouse, the analyst who reads too much death between the lines, the family member who waits without full knowledge, all of them are bent in ways public history rarely records. Even survival can look like ruin from close range. And then there was Penkovsky's family, left behind in Moscow beneath the shadow of his condemnation. We do not talk enough about the relatives of traitors in authoritarian systems. Officially, they may not stand trial themselves, at least not always in the later Soviet years, as in the worst period of Stalinism. But the punishment spreads anyway. Careers stall, apartments become tense with scrutiny, friends vanish, schoolmates repeat whispers they heard from their parents. The condemned man's wife must continue existing in a society where the state has already defined her household as stained. Imagine the silence at that dinner table after the trial, the unasked questions, the impossible task of explaining to children what has happened without repeating the language of the regime and without inviting fresh danger by contradicting it. This is the collateral damage that history books often flatten. Not only the death of the spy, the long afterlife of suspicion for those who shared his name, his rooms, his habits, his photographs. Espionage is one of the few professions in which a person may become famous for acts his own family cannot safely discuss. After Penkovsky's death, his case became part of Cold War mythology. Books appeared. Former officers spoke. Intelligence veterans argued about tradecraft, betrayal, timing, and his exact impact on the Cuban crisis. In 1965, what were presented as the Penkovsky Papers were published in the United States, though later questions were raised about their authenticity and editing. This only deepened the legend. The spy world feeds on documents, but it also feeds on uncertainty. The archive is never perfectly clean. Too many interests intervene. Too many memoirists polish themselves. Too many services protect old methods by blurring old truths. And so Penkovsky drifted into that strange space occupied by famous spies, where the facts remain solid enough to matter, yet porous enough for every generation to project its own anxieties onto them. To some, he became the insider who pierced Soviet deception. To others, he became an example of what happens when ambition and disillusionment combust inside a closed system. To still others, he remained a cautionary tale about tradecraft, about running a productive source for too long, about the danger of believing success can outpace surveillance in Moscow. All these readings contain something true. None contains the whole truth. The enduring lesson of Penkovsky's story lies partly in that incompleteness. Espionage seduces us because it promises revelation. Hidden files, secret meetings, dead drops, coded signals, dramatic trials. We imagine that at the center of the secret world there must be perfect clarity, the one hidden report that explains everything. Yet real intelligence history is rarely that generous. It gives us fragments, testimonies under pressure, official lies mixed with official truths, memoirs written with vanity and regret. Penkovsky passed extraordinary information. He died for it. But even now, long after Lubyanka's interrogators and many of his handlers have gone to their graves, some parts of the case remain disputed in detail. That is not a failure of history. It is its nature. Secrets rot unevenly. And still, amid all the ambiguity, a few things remain sharp. The atmosphere of the era was suffocating. A man could rise through military academies, wear his medals, serve the state, and still find himself morally estranged from the system that claimed him. The objective of his mission, once he crossed over into espionage, was not random theft. It was to give the West a realistic picture of Soviet strength, especially missile strength, at a moment when illusion could invite nuclear war. His cover was built not through invented foreign identities, but through the disciplined maintenance of his existing Soviet one. The adversary he faced was not lazy or melodramatic. It was patient, watchful, and institutionally ruthless. His do-or-die moment was not a single gunfight, but the slow realization that the circle of surveillance had tightened, and that every familiar signal might already belong to the enemy. The intelligence puzzle was solved not by one miracle document, but by thousands of photographed pages and countless acts of analysis in London and Washington. The sacrifices were irreversible. His life, Wynn's health, his family's future. The immediate fallout was arrest, trial, execution, and a global intelligence reckoning. After the dust settled, Penkovsky became both warning and weapon in the memory of the Cold War. And the lesson for later generations is severe. States built on fear breed betrayal as surely as they punish it. Yet even those who betray in the name of preventing disaster are not spared disaster themselves. This, perhaps, is the final melancholy truth. Penkovsky may have helped reduce the chance of a catastrophic miscalculation in 1962, but he could not save himself from the logic of the world he inhabited. The same Cold War that made him valuable also made him disposable. Intelligence services praise courage in internal memoranda and mourn brave sources in private, but the source still goes alone into the cell. The medals, if there are any, are awarded in silence. The grave, if marked at all, does not explain the scale of what was risked there. When I think of him now, I do not first imagine the courtroom or even the arrest. I imagine a colder, quieter image. A Moscow evening before the end. Street lamps reflected in wet pavement. Traffic moving beneath a low sky. Somewhere beyond the Kremlin walls, officials discussing missiles, prestige, and power. Somewhere nearer, a colonel walking home with secrets in his head and dread moving just behind his ribs. He knows more than he can safely carry. He may already suspect that the city has begun to notice him. Yet he continues. One step, then another. That is how history is often made in the shadows, not in grand gestures, but in the lonely decision to keep walking when every instinct warns that the night has changed. Oleg Penkovsky belonged to an age when paper could be more dangerous than explosives, when truth itself could be contraband, and when the fate of millions might hinge on whether one man inside the enemy's fortress chose to speak. He did speak. The world listened, though it could not protect him. And in that cruel gap between usefulness and rescue lies the full human weight of espionage. Our story ends here for today. Thank you for listening. If you found value in this journey into the past, please share this story, leave a like, and subscribe. Until next time, stay safe and remember, history is often made in the shadows.